Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Beastly Talks. My name is Stian Helling, and I will be your host for this podcast today and forever in the future, I presume. Now, we have done a little bit of an introduction on who I am and what I do, and now it's time to actually get stuck into some dog training. Now, before we start talking about actual dog training, we need to understand how dogs perceive the world, because it is different from how we perceive the world. And unless we actually know what's going on in the dog's head, it can be difficult to deal with, especially problem behaviors. I mean, any dog can be taught behaviors such as sit, drop, stand quite easily with a little bit of food and a little bit of patience. But when we get to more complex things like aggression, anxiety, stress responses, and so on and so forth, we kind of need to understand the bigger picture of how dogs think, how they learn. And so what I want to do in this episode is I want to talk about your beast's perspective. And so essentially how your dog perceives the world, how it's different from how we perceive the world, and how we can actually relate to our dogs in a more accurate and better sense. Because this is going to help us moving forward, especially when it comes to more complex behavioral issues. So I want to start by saying that, and I teach this in my puppy development workshop. But there's a slide in that workshop that essentially says, what is your puppy made up of? And what I break it down to is your puppy or your dog is made up of genetics. It's made up of personality, desires, and drives. It's natural resilience, meaning confidence that the dog comes with from birth. And at the end of it, slobber, obviously, because puppies slobber a lot, right? But so these are the things to me that I boil a dog down to when I first meet a new dog or a new puppy and I'm going to start helping them. And obviously, genetics. I mean, I can do a lot with training and understanding learning theory and operant conditioning and so on and so forth. But the one thing I cannot change about a dog ever is its DNA. And so the genetic profile of the dog that we have in front of us is always going to be, in one way or form, most likely limiting. And when I say limiting, I don't mean that necessarily as a bad thing, but being someone who works primarily with high drive dogs, what I do see very often is that people get a high drive dog, meaning a dog with natural high level of prey drive, which I'll break down what that means a little bit later. But they have this very high energy, highly driven dog that wants to do things and wants to learn things. And they expect it to be a couch potato. Now, this is where we're going to start butting heads with genetics, because at the end of the day, the genetic makeup of the dog is something we cannot really battle with training. Now, we can utilize super heavy levels of unfair punishment to take away drives from a dog. But again, that is not dog training to me. That is the opposite, right? So we work with the dog. We try and work with the genetics. We try and get them to fit in, to teach the owner skills, to give the dog what we call biological fulfillment. Basically, the dog's natural drive and desire, to give them an outlet for that and to actually help them satiate that genetic desire that the dog naturally comes with. So genetics, at the end of the day, is not really something we can combat. It's something we have to work with. Personality. So pretty much every single dog that I've ever met has their own distinct personality. Now, when we talk about particular breeds of dogs, often those personalities will kind of align a little bit in the dog's desires and drives, but every dog is an individual. And you see this especially in working dogs, whether they are German Shepherds and Malinois being trained for police work, or whether they're Border Collies and Kelpies being trained for herding work. A lot of them don't make it. And very often that comes down to a lack of genetic drive, but also very often I think it comes down to the dog's personality, where they just go like, hey, I love chasing after balls, but I don't really see the need to run after a 250 kilo merino sheep. And so when we look at all of these things, the genetics, the personality, the drives in the dog, and also the natural resilience or the dog's confidence level, because a lot of dogs come with a fairly low level of confidence. And again, very often we boil this down to genetics. Now, we can work hard to build a dog's confidence and to build up their natural resilience towards stressful events and unexpected events. But it is going to be capped by the genetics. So if you have a puppy, and I've seen this because I've fostered and rehomed a lot of litters of dogs, and you can have 8 dogs from in the same litter, so from the same parents, and they're all very different. And again, that doesn't just boil down to personality, that also boils down to how driven they are for something. And often we try and test that with play primarily. Does a dog want to chase after a ball? Does it want to bite a rag and hold on to that and shake it, right? Or is it more on the softer side, where it would prefer to just sit in a corner by itself and chew on a stick, right? These are all, at the end of the day, genetics, but more so towards personality and personal drives. Now, again, building up confidence we can do to a certain point, but pretty much all dogs have a limited window of genetic confidence that we need to work within. And a lot of dogs with lower levels of confidence are very often not going to make it as working dogs. However, they can be great pets, right? So, again, coming back to breed, which is what I was talking about originally, like, yeah, the dog has the same breed, so it's bred for a specific purpose, but that doesn't mean all dogs are the same and have the same personality and desires and drives. Right. And this boils down to what we always talk about, is that every dog's an individual. And where a lot of kind of cookie cutter approaches fall apart, so you'll see a lot of big companies that have like, hey, we have a system. The system is XYZ, and that's how we train all dogs. And you go, well, I mean, that might work in a limited sense, but at the end of the day, if you're not looking at the dog in front of you, if you're not experimenting with that dog's interest and drives and desires and personality and confidence as different from the dog that you worked with the day before, you are your training is most likely going to fall apart. And so, yeah, it is very important to be able to look at a dog and say, hey, I can see what you're struggling with. I can see where your issues are. Now I'm going to start prodding and poking a little bit. I'm going to start throwing some things, and I'm going to try and find out what you're actually made up of. Anyone who just walks in and goes like, hey, this is the training tool that we use, and this is how we hold the leash, and they start dragging that dog around, they're unlikely to have good results. Now, before I continue on here, I want to go through and define and explain some words. And these are words that you'll hear me mention a lot. And I just want everyone to have a clear understanding of what we're actually talking about when we're hearing these words. And the first one is arousal. We talk a lot about arousal when we talk about dogs and dog training. And it's important to understand that when we talk about arousal, we're not talking about sexual drive. We are talking about arousal from a point of view of excitement and readiness. So, a dog that has high level of arousal tends to be moving a lot. They tend to be pacing a lot because they're kind of always on the ready. They're ready to go, especially if they haven't been taught properly how to regulate their own arousal, how to come down in arousal, and how to actually relax. And so, arousal and high arousal and hyperarousal are terms you'll hear me very often talk about. And just understand that that's nothing sexual. It's the dog's excitement levels and how quickly they get amped up and how ready they are to do things a lot of the time. Um, you'll also hear me talk a lot about frustration. And frustration is a very natural thing, but in dogs, and unfortunately, as you know, there are more and more legislations and restrictions being put on dogs, their worlds become smaller and smaller, right? They're not allowed to go many places. They can't be off leash anywhere, right? There are so many restrictions, and all of these restrictions make the dog's world very small. And small worlds tend to lead to big feelings. And so, by big feelings, obviously, we talk about things like reactivity, where a dog is lunging and barking at everything that moves around them. Now, there is a lot more to understanding reactivity and aggression, which I will get into so much more in the future. But the word frustration in itself is defined as the prevention of progress, success, or fulfillment of something. So, frustration is very often created by barriers. And so that can be in a case where we're holding the dog back. So the dog wants to go and sniff something, wants to go and say hi to a dog. We have a leash on the dog. We're holding the dog back, creating a barrier that is causing frustration, which is leading the dog to blow up. So frustration is another thing that I will be talking a lot about. And, you know, most people that have been angry at some point understand how frustration works. But it's good to have a definition of it. So that's the prevention of progress, success, or fulfillment of something. Then we have pressure. Now, pressure can be both physical or emotional, and it's defined as physical or emotional force. Now, you can have someone grab you by the arm and pull on your arm. Now, that would be pressure in a physical force sense, where they're trying to move and shift your body physically. And now, pressure from an emotional perspective, I tend to refer to as stress rather than pressure. The way that we talk about stress and pressure in dogs and dog training specifically is I try to separate the two, because we talk a lot about pressure, and that is more the physical act of applying some form of physical force to the dog in order to move them or shift their behavior. Whereas stress, the emotional strain, is more what triggers behavior in the dog rather than actually moving them from point A to point B. And so that's the general distinction that I like to make. And so, yeah, pressure is then physical force that is applied to an object in order to shift that object's position. Now, we'll get into stress as well, just to get an idea of what the difference between, or how I define stress and pressure differently. So, pressure physically moves. Now, stress is a state of mental or emotional strain or tension resulting from adverse or demanding circumstances. And So to me, that is if you have a dog that has had a lack of socialization, a dog that has a lack of confidence, isn't very resilient to tolerating changes in behavior, for example. Um, that emotional strain very quickly leads to a stress response, and that stress response very often triggers the behavior in the dog. Now, another thing that is very important to understand is that both pressure and stress are cumulative. So, what does that mean? Well, for as long as the dog or human experiences physical or emotional strain, that physical and emotional strain keeps building to the point where stress becomes critical and we have to shift our behavior to respond to it. And so, a simple example would be, say, you have a child, right? And you're sitting and having a conversation with another adult, but the child suddenly goes, "Hey, here's something that's very important to me that I need you to respond to." So the kid then comes up and they start tapping you on the shoulder and they go, "Mum, mum, 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 mum," as they're tapping you on the shoulder. Now, every time they say mum and every time they tap you on the shoulder, that stress or that pressure from the child builds and accumulates to the point where you eventually cannot ignore it anymore and you turn around and you go, "What? Be quiet, the adults are talking." Right? And so that's what we mean when we talk about pressure and stress being cumulative. Now, so that's more from the physical side of things, where the child's tapping you on the shoulder and repeating words to annoy you into essentially making or giving you them attention. Giving your attention to them. Struggling with words today. Great time to record a podcast, but here we are. Now, from a stress point of view, this is perceived a little bit different. And so the way that I like to explain it is, imagine that you're scared of spiders. Now, you're sitting at the dinner table, you might just be reading the news, having some breakfast, whatever. Suddenly you look up and you see a massive huntsman on the wall. So a huntsman is a very common spider that we have down here in Australia, completely harmless, but they're huge and they look terrifying. Now, the second you see that spider, what happens is your body tenses and you begin to experience stress. Now, what that means is cortisol and adrenaline floods into your body. And that is eventually going to prepare you to shift behavior. Now, at this point, this fake made up spider in your head that you're actually looking at is far enough away for you to not have an immediate panic attack. Now, if that spider dropped out of the ceiling and landed on your head, you would have, like, the stress would have exploded and you would have activated into behavior immediately by jumping up, screaming, flailing your arms, whatever it is, right? In order to try and alleviate that stress. But now, that fictional spider that we're talking about may be 3, 4, 5 meters away from you. So you've seen it, you're aware of the trigger, but you think to yourself, okay, be an adult, just go back to reading the newspaper and ignore the thing that is up there on the wall away from you. But here's what happens is you go back to reading the newspaper, but you start side-eyeing the spider. So you start looking up to the side and you're like, oh, damn, he's still there. Now, every time you look, there is a little spike of cortisol and adrenaline being pumped into your body, meaning stress is increasing and accumulating at that point. Then suddenly the spider moves a little bit. Now there is a big bump because there is a shift in behavior in the spider, and that is bumping your stress levels. Now, this continues on until eventually your stress cup overflows, and at this point, we have to activate into behavior. Now, when we have to activate into behavior from a stress response, we generally have two options. Well, we technically have four options, but when we're talking about dogs and particularly fearful situations, it's effectively two. And those are fight or flight responses. Now, the other two are friend or freeze, meaning you try to befriend the thing that is scaring you, or you freeze and you hope the thing goes away. But those are not things we see very often, especially me who deals with a lot of reactivity and aggression. It is usually a fight or flight response. So now the spider has gotten to you. Even though it's still from a distance, that stress has built to a point where you go, shit, I need to deal with this now. So you push your chair away from the table and you either run out of the room screaming for help, which would be the flight response, or you run to grab a newspaper, or you roll up the newspaper that you had in front of you and you go to smash and kill the spider. And so this is what we mean by both pressure and stress being cumulative. Whether you're physically feeling a sensation of pressure that is aversive, the longer that continues for, the more aware of it you become, the more likely you are to respond to it. And it's the same thing with mental or emotional stress that builds and builds and builds to the point where you go, well, now the emotional strain or the fear or anxiety that I'm experiencing is so high that I have to activate into behavior in order to try and alleviate this pressure and stress. All right, so I went on a little bit of a tangent there, but again, really understanding stress and pressure is crucial, especially when you're working with anxious, fearful dogs and some form of reactivity or aggression. And sorry for rambling on about that, but very important stuff to understand here. Now, back to the words that we need to define. The next one is prey drive. So, prey drive is the dog's innate instinct to hunt. So we talk about the predatory motor sequence. So essentially, how predators hunt, kill, and eat, and that is broken down into orient, which is orient towards the prey. It's then stalking towards the prey. We then go into chase as the dog gets close enough, where they're now going full pelt to try and get a hold of the thing. Then we have the grab bite. So this is when the dog latches onto the prey in order to try and slow them down. We then progress to the kill bite, where the predator will latch on to usually the nose or the throat in order to try and suffocate or bleed out the animal. Now, when the animal is dead, we then go into dissection. This is where they rip the carcass open and then eventually it's consumption. Now, prey drive, with high drive dogs, we usually breed more parts of, we breed more of certain part of the predatory motor sequence into the dog because that's what we use for work. So, for example, your Kelpies, your Border Collies, your cattle dogs, there's more orienting, stalking, and chasing because that's their job, right? You have a big flock of sheep, and suddenly sheep number 412 moves 5 centimeters to the left. The dog has to exploit into activity and bark at the sheep to drive them back into the spot that they're meant to be. Whereas with your German Shepherds, your Malinois, your Rottweilers, Dobermans, your more protection style dog, it's more chasing, grabbing, and I say killing, right? They're not actually meant to kill, but the grabbing and holding and shaking is simulating the kill sequence. And so that's their job. Therefore, we tend to breed more of the chase, grab, and kill. I say kill in inverted commas into them. Now, the more prey drive the dog has, the more we have to find substitute behaviors to try and alleviate that prey drive, because unattended to prey drive tends to lead out in all forms of reactivity and aggression and frustration and anxiety, and the dog being generally unfulfilled. Which brings me to the next one, which is reactivity. Now, we hear the word reactivity mentioned very often. Um, Now, most people understand the word aggression. Aggression is kind of straightforward, whereas reactivity, there's a lot of different ways that people explain it and look at reactivity. Now, the way that I try and define it is that it's an exaggerated response to a trigger. So essentially, it's the dog overreacting to something they shouldn't really be overreacting to. And again, this very often comes from high states of arousal. It comes from frustration. It can come from fear, anxiety, etc., etc. But at the end of the day, reactivity I look at more as just an over exaggeration to something that the dog shouldn't necessarily really care that much about. And this is very common in fearful dogs or dogs with little control over their arousal, little outlet for their drive, because all of this just leads to frustration. And now you have a dog that's walking down the street on a harness and it is just spinning in circles, barking at everything because it's just so over the top all the time. And part of what we do with these dogs is obviously we try and find outlets for them through play, work. Um, we try and build their confidence if it's fearful or anxious dogs. If it's anxiety as well, we try to build some more independence into the dog, giving them more structure as that helps take away the anxiety. And towards the end, we will almost always have to introduce some form of aversive pressure or punishment to try and work through all of this. Um, Another thing that we talk about is recovery. And so recovery is essentially the time that it takes for a dog to overcome or work through a stressful event. And so when we're testing puppies, for example, we tend to look a lot at recovery time in the puppy. So you'll have a 6-week-old puppy, they're just kind of stomping around, they're doing their little puppy thing, they're growling a bit, they're playing with the other dogs, they might be biting a toy, right? And at that point, if we introduce um, some form of aversive, and very often it's just a loud sound, right? We might drop a metal pan on the ground, which creates a big noise. And what you'll see is all the puppies will startle. They will freeze and they will startle and they'll look towards where the sound came from. Now, the time that it takes for the dog to get out of that fixation on where the sound came from and for them to roll back into, oh, I'm going to go back to biting this thing or playing with my siblings. That is kind of how we look at the recovery time. And the shorter the recovery time, generally the higher the level of confidence and stability in genetics we tend to have. And again, this is kind of how we measure a dog that has reactivity or aggression towards a particular trigger as well. We tend to look at how quickly does the dog come back from that. And I worked with dogs that, you know, in a 45-minute walk, they wouldn't recover in that time until they were back inside the house. Whereas now, with training through clarity, through utilizing reinforcement and punishment and everything, I'm going to talk more about the learning theory in the next podcast. But through clearly explaining to the dog what we want from them and what we don't want from them, through building relationship, through building confidence, to reducing anxiety, what we want to look at is a very clear um, reduction in the time it takes the dog to recover. So this dog that would take 45 minutes to recover, he's now down to, well, reacting very rarely, but the few times that he does react, the recovery time is 5 to 10 seconds. So from 45 minutes to 5 to 10 seconds, that is a massive decrease. And that's probably as good as he's ever going to get. Um, and that is because of some genetic issues as well. Now, moving on, we then need to talk about self-reinforcement. So again, I'm gonna explain much more detail what reinforcement is in the next podcast, but essentially the definition of reinforcement is to increase the frequency, intensity, and likelihood of a behavior happening again. So any behavior that gets reinforced will be more likely to happen. It will happen usually faster and with more intensity as well as it continues to get reinforced. Now, self-reinforcement is where a specific or particular behavior becomes innately reinforcing to the dog, meaning there is no external reinforcement coming from the trainer. And so, say for example, if I have a dog with plenty of prey drive, usually one of the first things that I'll do is I'll teach him how to play tug. Right. So now I can bring out a tug. I can get the dog to interact with me and I can create reinforcement, making the dog feel good whenever it has done something that I like. Now, that's a bit different in self reinforcement because the reinforcement comes from inside the dog. And there are so many endless examples of this, but I'll give you just two very quick examples. Um, the first one can be a dog that is counter surfing, right? The dog has had an opportunity to be in the kitchen. It jumps up on the kitchen bench and it finds a whole chicken lying there waiting to get into the oven. Now, obviously, that behavior of jumping up on the counter is going to be highly self-reinforcing to the dog because he found such a big reinforcement at the end of it after he's eaten the whole chicken. Now, another form of reinforcement is, especially in dogs that are fearful, is being able to utilize a particular behavior in order to create distance away from the thing that's stressing them. So if I have a dog that's fearful of other dogs, for example, and I'm walking this dog on a leash, now this dog then sees another dog and starts experiencing stress. The stress accumulates and builds as the dog gets closer to us, and eventually it leads to the dog needing to react to or behave, shift its behavior in order to try and alleviate its stress, thereby reacting to the trigger. Now, when I have a leash on the dog, and the dog then feels the need to trigger into fight or flight, well, at this point, running away to create distance from the trigger is no longer an option. And so the dog is left only with the ability to fight. So my dog now lunges forwards, it barks, it bares its teeth, it snaps, it spins in a circle, it goes crazy. Now, if the other dog or the other trigger at that point moves away from the dog, then what happens is the dog now becomes self-reinforced because the fear is removed, making the dog feel safe again. And so this is where a lot of reactivity begins, and this is why a lot of people are unable to get rid of the reactivity by themselves without working with a skilled and experienced trainer. So that is self-reinforcement. It just means the dog from inside of itself gets some form of reinforcement through a positive experience or through an alleviation of a stressful experience. And then finally, I want to talk about stress tolerance. Now, stress tolerance is pretty straightforward now that we understand what stress is and how it works. But essentially, what we do when we especially develop puppies, but also when we're working with fearful, anxious, nervy dogs, is we try to build their stress tolerance. And stress tolerance is literally just the ability to withstand stressful events. And all of these things that I've talked about here are important because they all work around each other. Arousal, creating that high level of excitement and anticipation all the time, can lead to anxiety. That anxiety, if untreated, can lead to fear. Then the pressure from something externally coming at you leads to reactivity. Then the recovery time that it takes you to come back from that experience also affects your mental state and can increase anxiety. The frustration you're experiencing of having these things happening over and over again leads to more innate and natural stress. And then the especially aggressive and reactive behavior then becomes self-reinforcing. So the dog thinks, well, I know how to control the world around me. And I do that by displaying aggressive behavior. And all of this just continues and it builds and it gets worse and worse. And again, I think probably 90% of people who contact me regarding some form of reactivity or aggression in their dog, they all say the same thing. It started anywhere from a few weeks to months to years ago. And they always follow up by saying it's getting worse. Yeah, because all of these things are working in unison and they're all kind of working out for the dog, right? The dog's finding self-reinforcement in particular aggressive behavior, but that doesn't actually reduce the dog's arousal or anxiety. It actually increases it. So the dog becomes more and more fearful, more and more likely to react with more and more intensity from further away, and the frustration of not having leadership. You can see this just becomes like a soup of uh, like a pressure cooker that is just constantly building and driving the dog into undesirable, highly stressful, and borderline insane behaviors at times. So those are some words that I'll be using a lot, and hopefully you have a better understanding of them now. So when I mention them, I don't have to actually go through and explain it all in this level of detail again. All right, so now that we have a better understanding of some words and some concepts, now we get to the big question. What is the big question? Well, this is the big question. Why does a dog do anything? I'm pretty sure that every single dog trainer in whatever methodology or way that they train, they have had hundreds of iterations of this particular question. Why does my dog do this? Why does my dog jump on this? Why does my dog run away with this? Why does my dog do this in this particular setting? Now, there are a million different iterations of this particular question, but the answer is very simple. Why does a dog do anything? It does it to better its own situation. Every single dog on the planet is inherently egotistical, and if they think something is going to work out for them, they are going to try to see if it will. Now, it's important here to jump in and mention something that I see a surprising amount of people still talk about, and I'm not 100% sure why. But it's this idea that, and you primarily hear this from, I guess, more old school alpha dog type trainers, that the dog is always trying to get one over on you. It's almost like you're living with this furry thing whose entire existence is built upon fucking with you, which is ridiculous. Um, but I think this is more of a way of excusing more heavy-handed training. I think that's what it is. It's because if you genuinely believe that the furry apex predator that you live with is just actively trying to ruin your life all the time, well, then it becomes easier to justify some more heavy-handed training. But again, this is nonsense. The dog's not out to get you. It's not out to make your life difficult. It's only there to try and find a way of making its own life better. That's why a dog does anything. And again, dogs are incredibly highly motivated and driven to better their own situation, which is what we often refer to as pushy, right? The dog being pushy. Like I always say, if you give a dog an inch, they are going to try to take 400 miles, right? The second they manage to push past the boundary and they get something out of it, you put the dog into a cycle of behavior where they're just going to escalate and try to work harder and harder and harder to push that boundary further and further. And again, this is not because the dog's trying to fuck with you. It's because they think the grass is greener on the other side. And if I can just push through this thing, I will have a massive reinforcement at the end of it and I will be successful. So again, forget this whole thing that the dog's out to get you, but do understand that dogs are incredibly pushy if they think something's going to benefit them. Um, Another thing that's very important to understand is that dogs are behaviorally driven. Now, what we mean by behaviorally driven is that the dog is not cognitive. Dogs aren't cognitive thinkers like us people are. And so, what that means is when you and I, as human beings, when we encounter a problem of some sort or an obstacle of some sort, what we do is we sit down and we think about it and we research it and we talk to other people about it. We try to gather as much information as possible and then make a decision based on that, what the easiest way or the most effective way to get past that barrier will be. Now, for dogs, it's a little bit different because dogs, when they encounter an obstacle or a problem of some sort, they begin offering behaviors to the problem to see what alleviates it or what removes it. And I like to use this example because I think this is probably one of the easiest ones to understand. But imagine you have a puppy. Now, when we have puppies, obviously it's important to build some independence in those puppies. And a lot of people innately understand this. And so they go like, all right, cool, I'm going to teach my dog to be a little bit more independent. So today I am going to pop him in the backyard by himself. Now, what we do is we pick up the puppy, we carry them out, we go inside and we close the door. Now the puppy goes, well, fuck, this sucks. I don't want to be outside. I want to be inside where my people are. Right. And so now the puppy is presented with an obstacle, something that's preventing it from getting to what it wants. And so now what happens is the puppy begins offering behaviors to the door. Now they might sit in front of the door, they might stand, they might scratch the door, they might spin in a circle. Very often you'll see them cycle through behaviors to go like, hey, how do I dismantle this barrier and get to my reinforcer, which in this case is my people. Now, most puppies will eventually escalate to a point where they go to the most, what appears to be the most functional behavior at this point, because they're trying to get the attention of the humans, and that is barking. So now the puppy goes, boof, boof, boof. Hey, let me in. I don't want to be out here. Woof, woof, woof. Why am I here? Now, if a dog thinks that a behavior is going to be successful, they will double down for quite a long time. And so the puppy continues to bark and bark and bark and might jump up, it might scratch the door a little bit more. All of these are attention-seeking behaviors at this point to go like, hey, you left me outside, let me come back in. Now, what happens is very often after about 5 or so minutes, we as people go like, oh my God, I can't take it anymore. I can't listen to my puppy barking. And so we go and we open the door. Now, at this point, we are removing the barrier, allowing the dog to get to its reinforcer. And so now the dog has a learning experience. It learns that, oh shit, 5 minutes of barking, that's how the door opens. Now, whenever a behavior has become reinforced in the past, it becomes more resilient to what we call extinction. And I should probably talk about what an extinction burst is, but I'll continue on my puppy story for now. And so on day 2, we go, okay, I really need to teach this puppy to be outside. So we picked him up again, we carried him out, we put him down, we go inside, we shut the door. Now the puppy walks up to the door and it goes, okay, he begins a 5-minute cycle of barking and it starts boof, 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 boof. Now, On this day, we're feeling particularly persistent because we realized we maybe made a mistake by letting the dog in while it was barking yesterday. And so after about 5 minutes of barking, we're now sitting in a corner in the kitchen, rocking, holding our head, going like, oh my God, I'm trying to be in my happy place. I can't listen to the puppy bark anymore, blah, 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 blah. Now, the dog or the puppy at this point stops and it goes, well, this is weird. Barking for 5 minutes yesterday worked. Why is it not working today? But because the dog has had a reinforcement history of this particular behavior in the past, it now goes back to, well, I'm going to try a little bit harder. This is the pushy side of dogs. So the puppy begins another 5 minute cycle of barking. Ba, 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 right? Often with a little bit more intensity at this point. And I'll explain why there's more intensity this time around. But the dog barks for another 5 minutes, and suddenly we go, oh my God, I can't take it anymore. Someone's going to call the council. I'm going to get in trouble with my neighbors. As what we do is we walk up and we open that door and we let the puppy in. Now, what happens in the puppy's mind is this. Okay, yesterday it was 5 minutes of barking that opened the door. Today, it's 10 minutes of barking that opens the door. And so what we're doing now is we're creating a behavioral cycle where the dog will persist in a particular behavior for longer and longer and longer in order to reach its reinforcement. Now, when you understand all of this, this can be super helpful in the training of behaviors. But when you don't understand what you're doing, it very quickly leads to massive problem behaviors where you have a dog that will be screaming in the backyard for 8 hours while you're at work. And so the behaviorally driven side of things is really important to understand because this is where a lot of um, unintended, accidental behavior problems come from. And this is where we talk about accidental reinforcement. Now, before I get stuck into this, I just want to explain what an extinction burst is because I mentioned that. But an extinction burst is essentially a blocking of access to a barrier that increases the intensity of a behavior. The intensity will increase and increase and increase and increase until the extinction burst happens, where essentially you give up on the particular behavior because you're not getting the reinforcement that you're expecting anymore. And so there's a couple of fun examples of this. The simplest one is you walk into a room in your house and you flick the light switch. Now, you have a long history of reinforcement of the light coming on at this point, but on this particular day, no lights being presented. So what do? Well, you flick the switch a couple more times, tip, 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 and you increase the intensity of and the repetition of how many times you flick that switch before you go, fuck it, it's not working. Light bulb must be broken, right? But that is a very short example of an extinction burst. Another one is if you put money in a vending machine, right? You put money in a vending machine, you press E12, and you see the thing starts to spin, but then it locks into place, and whatever you order doesn't actually fall down and is presented to you as a reinforcer. Now, at this point, you will most likely go, what the fuck? And you will tap the vending machine, and you will tap it dum, 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 with more and more intensity, and even shaking it in order to try and release the object that is the reinforcer for you. Eventually, you realize the thing is stuck, and so you give up, you give it one last big hit, and you scream some profanities, and you give up and you walk away. That's another example of an extinction burst. And so what would have happened with the puppy barking out the door if we just left them for long enough, and I should just put in a caveat here, this is so long as the dog doesn't have severe anxiety or separation anxiety or any particular behavioral issues, it is just being pushy at that point. Because if you have big anxiety or separation related behavioral issues, then we kind of have to deal with them before we can put the dog into an extinction burst. But at this point, if you have a perfectly healthy, chill, fun puppy, they will continue barking for a while. Eventually, they'll give up and they'll walk away and they'll do their own thing. And so now, because the dog never got reinforcement for barking at the door, it never became a problem. And this is very important to understand because the vast majority of problem behaviors that I see, especially in young dogs, is because we give in to the dog too quickly. Because they're cute, right? And I get it. Like, why put your dog outside? You want them inside with you. Uh, but it is important to understand that building up independence in a dog, teaching them to be calm by being by themselves, is a super important life skill and should not be ignored. And so now I want to then delve into accidental reinforcement. And accidental reinforcement is very often where a dog, um, where something very unexpected happens, and the dog responds with a behavior in almost a just panic, like I didn't see that coming type response. And if it then gets an immediate solution to its problem, then this very quickly becomes a behavioral cycle that can be difficult to break. Um, Leash reactivity is probably one of the most common. Is probably one of the most common situations here. So, say you have a dog that is a little bit maybe fearful of other dogs. Maybe it missed out on some early socialization. Maybe it had a bad experience with a dog, something that made it fearful. Now, you're taking this dog out, and again, you're just taking them for a walk around the block. And as the puppy is sniffing, as they're looking at you, as you give them the occasional treat, they're kind of just going about their day, not a big deal. You get to a corner. And as soon as you hit that corner, suddenly another dog pops out in front of you. You didn't see it coming because you didn't see what was behind the corner. And now your dog is immediately within a short distance of something that normally makes them fearful. Now, effectively, that spider has dropped out of the ceiling and landed on your head, and the dog that your dog is then just exploiting into a particular behavior. Most likely, a massive retraction where it tries to move as far away in a full fledged panic as possible, or very often they will react with some form of reactive aggressive behavior, meaning they will lunge, they will bark, they will try and drive the other dog away. Now, if that dog goes away, the stress is immediately released, which is giving the dog reinforcement because not experiencing stress is a reinforcing and pleasant behavior. Now, what may happen is you have accidentally created a reinforcement history of reactivity. And this is very often where reactive behaviors start because people they they aren't as aware of their surroundings as we are as dog trainers. But also, if something like this happens unexpectedly, as trainers, we deal with it immediately because we know what needs to be done to prevent this from becoming an ongoing problem. Whereas most people don't know that. And so they might just drag the dog away from there or pick them up and run away, right? All of these things will alleviate stress in the dog, making the dog feel better, thereby accidentally reinforcing the behavior. Now we end up with is a behavioral cycle where the dog goes, when I feel stressed, I react with aggressive behavior. That aggressive behavior drives away the thing that stresses me. I have alleviation of stress, which makes me feel good. And now the behavior cycle continues on and on and on. All right. So now, hopefully, we all have a much better understanding of what happens in our dog's brain, and we can see the world a little bit better through their eyes, right? Again, the reason why a dog does anything is to try and better its own position. Whether that is acquiring something they perceive to be reinforcing, or whether it's trying to drive away something that makes them fearful or stressed, that is also going to be reinforcing. And so, this again is very often where accidental problem behaviors come from. And now the dog continues to practice those behaviors because it goes, well, I think I know how the world works. I bark at anything that's scary, the thing goes away, and I feel safe again. But again, the problem is anything you practice, you get better at. And so by the time people contact me, they usually say, hey, we've got really bad reactivity in our dog. It began 12 months ago and it's getting worse. Yep, because your dog's practicing it and it's getting results from practicing it. That's where most people get stuck. So to finish off here, I want to make I want to talk about one thing that I think is a big problem, especially in a lot of behavior modification and early development. And when I say early development, that can be early development of puppies, but it can also be early development of a relationship with a new dog. So if you have a rescue dog, for example, that you've gone and gotten from the shelter, those first few days and weeks that you guys are living together are critical in order for you to develop a relationship and develop boundaries and an understanding of each other so that you can have a good, healthy relationship and a good life together. Um, and one of the things that I hear a lot of people say is ignore bad behavior. And this is very problematic because when you ignore behavior, you do not show the dog the full picture. And ignoring is kind of not directing the dog in any way. Uh, like, if you see something you don't like and you just look away, that doesn't actually make the problem go away. It just makes you ignorant to it, and the problem gets to persist freely. And that is where I come in, and I never ignore behavior. I decide before I meet a dog or a puppy. I have an idea of where I want them to go. I have a very clear plan for how I'm going to get them there. And I punish any undesirable behavior. I don't ignore them. Because what this leads to is very quickly I can set boundaries for the dog and I can say, hey, you cannot do this one thing, but if you do something else, and I'm going to show you what that other thing is as well, I can begin reinforcing you. Now, the problem with ignoring is it very often puts the dog into an attempt at an extinction burst, right? So, like we know now, the reason why a dog does anything is to try and better its own position. So jumping is a very common example of this, right? You have a dog that gets excited about you, right? Which is great because that's why we keep dogs around. But it gets so aroused and so overexcited that it starts jumping and scratching at you to try and get attention. Now, a very common, well, what a lot of trainers would say, and these are usually trainers that steer clear of any form of pressure or punishment, is they'll say, hey, just turn around and ignore your dog jumping and scratching on you. Well, great. Now I have scratches on the front of me and the back of me. And what happens is the dog, as he's scratching my back, he just kind of stops, walks in front of me, and jumps up again. So it's incredibly ineffective. And what happens is you tend to frustrate the dog more because he's not getting the reinforcer that he's used to. So now he's going to escalate his behavior. He's going to jump higher. He's going to scratch harder. He's going to start barking while he's scratching in order to try and get that attention from you. Now you begin the extinction burst. And if the dog has a reinforcement history of this particular behavior, that extinction burst is going to be intense and it may even hurt or injure you along the way, right? This comes to mouthing as well, like puppies that haven't been punished for biting human skin will think, well, they will get something out of it. And again, the ignoring part of mouthing in puppies is don't punish the puppy for biting you. It's just redirect them onto another toy. Well, great. Now we're creating a behavioral cycle where the puppy bites me. I squeal and I say, ow, because it hurts. And then I bring out a toy and I start playing with the puppy. What are we teaching the puppy now? Well, if you want to play, if you want interaction from anyone in the family, you latch onto them first. And that's what begins the reinforcement cycle. Now we get stuck. So what I do is I always draw a line in the sand. I present that line in the sand to the dog. I say, hey, if you cross that line, unpleasant things are going to happen to you. But if you stay on my side of the line, nothing bad's ever going to happen. You're only going to have the most awesome time of your life. And so this is why we punish undesirable behavior. But then after we punish a behavior, we have to redirect the dog into a desirable behavior. I will get into this more deeply, but essentially, unless a dog is sleeping, they're always in behavior. If I punish a particular behavior, that means I'm taking that behavior away from the dog. I'm saying, hey, this behavior is not an option anymore. It is not going to lead to reinforcement. It is not something you're allowed to do. Now, if I do that, I have to replace that behavior with something. Right? Because if all we do is just try and punish away things we don't like, we end up with a flat dog that just doesn't do anything because it doesn't find any reinforcement in anything. And now you have an unhappy dog for life. And that is not the purpose of this. And that is not what punishment does if it's utilized in a proper way. But again, like I said, the next episode is going to be breaking down learning theory and really understanding how we train dogs to do things, how we stop them from doing things, and how we condition responses in a much more controlled and understandable manner. But essentially, I don't let dogs get away with anything. I tell them what not to do. Then I redirect them into what to do instead. Dogs don't operate in gray zones. Like for us humans, we live in gray zones most of the time, unless you are an extremist of some form or shape. But we can navigate those things. We can think through them. We can explain them to people. We can explain why we do something that seems irrational at a point in time because we have a plan moving forward. That doesn't really work for dogs because dogs go, hey, I'm going to try this thing. I'm going to see what the outcome is. If the outcome is pleasant, I'm going to continue doing it with more intensity. If it's unpleasant, I'm going to reduce the likelihood of doing the behavior again. And the more freedom we give to dogs, the more opportunity we give them to choice. The more opportunity we give them to make choices and the less guidance we give them, what we're actually doing is we tend to create a lot of anxiety in the dog because the dog goes, holy crap, I have no idea how to succeed here. I'm not being told what to do. I don't have a leader to look for help if I'm feeling stressed or unsure. I'm jumping on these people and they're just staring at me like they're waiting for me to do something else, but I don't know what to do. And this unpredictability actually causes anxiety. Some of the most anxious dogs I've ever met my entire life have been trained for years without any form of aversive feedback or punishment or correction. That's why they're so frantic, because they're always looking for that opportunity to make themselves feel good, but they don't understand that there is a time and a place to do nothing. And so that is why I personally never ignore any form of behavior. All right, so just to finish up, I really hope this has been helpful. I hope you have a better understanding of your dog and how they think and how they approach the world and where a lot of miscommunication between human and dog happens. Because we tend to use our words, we tend to try and rationalize. but dogs don't speak human. That's the problem. Like, again, some of the most anxious dogs I've ever met, they have owners that are just babbling to their dog 24/7. They're just talking, 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 talking. And the dog doesn't understand what's being said, but he's like, this must mean something because I can tell it's directed at me. And so they respond by exhibiting over aroused behaviors, and they get amped up and they start doing things. But there's never any clarity there. And so now you essentially have a being that is just blabbering to you, and you're trying your best to understand them, but you cannot. And that causes a lot of both frustration and anxiety and a lot of problem behaviors. But yeah, at the end of the day, here's the important thing. Dog training isn't rocket surgery, right? But it is a different way of thinking. As a good animal behavior manipulator, we have to be able to see the world from the animal's point of view and not inject our own emotions or thought patterns into that. All we can do with dogs is we can look at them and we can see changes. We can look at their body language. They can tell us whether they're uncomfortable, whether they're excited, whether they're over aroused, whether they're frantic, anxious. But again, we can't tell them not to do any of those things without speaking to them in a physical manner, because words to a dog mean nothing. So if I was going to leave you with final advice at the end of this episode, it would be keep your mouth shut and start talking to your dog with your reinforcers and with your correction. Tell them, hey, I like it when you do this, by giving them a piece of food or playing with them or patting them or saying good dog. Tell them when they're doing a wrong thing by blocking access to what they perceive as the reinforcer. Again, we'll get more deeply into how I stop particular behaviors and how I shift them into other behaviors. But I think for now, we'll leave it at that. Again, thank you so much for coming along to this episode. I hope it was helpful. My name is Stian Helling. As I've mentioned in the past, I have a company, a behavior modification dog training company in Melbourne, Australia, called Beautiful Beasts. I'm referred to, or my social media presence is Viking Dog Trainer. If you want to follow me on Instagram or Facebook, jump on there. If you have any questions, feel free to message me through my social media. Or if you have any thoughts on topics that you want to hear about, feel free to send that through as well. But for now, thanks a lot for listening, and go train your dog.